Dense fog draped the jagged ridge above the Kishon Valley. All was still, until a thunderclap cracked through the silence like a divine war cry. Out of the mist, a lone figure stood wrapped in a ragged camel hair mantle, unmoving, his eyes locked forward with unsettling calm. When fire falls from an empty sky, when stone boils and water flees, when the name of Jehovah is hurled into the wind, history forgets how to breathe. Tonight, we follow two men who defied kings, shattered idols, and brought nations to their knees. And the first is already here, waiting. The man knelt, pressing one hand into the stone beneath him. "Answer me, O Jehovah, show yourself," he whispered. And suddenly, flames exploded upward in a towering column of fire, shooting from the rocks like the fist of God. The sky blazed orange. Heat rolled down the valley. In the distance, soldiers stumbled back, Baal's priests collapsed to their knees, and a lone shepherd boy dropped his staff in terror. Remember this moment. A queen will swear a blood oath. A kingdom will split under divine fury. And a mantle, burning with heaven's touch, will fall to earth in search of another. As the fire faded and darkness reclaimed the mountaintop, the prophet rose. Silent. Steady. He turned and walked straight toward the viewer, into the unknown. Blackness swallowed him. And then, a title seared across the void, the two mighty prophets of Jehovah God, Elijah and Elisha. A deep drumbeat thundered as the title evaporated into smoke. Then, a burning map of Israel appeared, glowing with tension, the northern kingdom pulsing red, and the true story began. Israel's map burned in crimson light, the northern kingdom pulsing like a fresh wound. After Solomon's death, the united throne had fractured. 10 tribes broke away and plunged into rebellion. Omri, a ruthless military leader, rose to power and built Samaria as his stronghold. But it was his son, Ahab, who drove the final nail into Israel's spiritual coffin. Ahab did more evil in the sight of Jehovah than any king before him. He married Jezebel, the Sidonian princess whose name would become synonymous with corruption. Under her influence, Israel became a land not of covenant, but of compromise. Pagan altars towered where sacred ones once stood. Wooden poles of Asherah replaced the ark's memory. Prophets of Baal paraded through cities, chanting spells and slitting lambs upon unholy stones. In the palace, incense to foreign gods filled the halls where the name of Jehovah had once echoed. Children were taught to bow before lifeless idols. Priests who remained loyal to YHWH were hunted, silenced, or forced into hiding. And yet, through this storm of idolatry and arrogance, a single figure emerged, uninvited and unafraid. Elijah, the Tishbite from Gilead, stormed into Ahab's court without title or army. His voice thundered like prophecy itself. "As surely as Jehovah, the God of Israel, lives, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word." Gasps echoed through marble halls. Advisors froze. Jezebel's painted eyes narrowed. And Ahab, the king who bowed to carved wood, was stunned into silence. A guard's spear hissed through the air, striking a pillar behind Elijah. But the prophet didn't flinch. He turned, cloak swirling, and walked out of the palace as thunder rolled once more across the sky. Behind him, a kingdom gasped, unaware that its long drought had just begun. After delivering the drought's grim decree, Elijah vanished into the wilderness, not just to escape Ahab's fury, but because Jehovah himself had directed him to do so. "Go eastward," the voice of God had said, "and hide yourself by the brook Korath, east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." And so the prophet disappeared into the dry hills, into solitude, into silence. The brook was narrow, winding through the rocky creases like a silver thread of grace in a dying land. Elijah made his camp among jagged cliffs where shadows kept him hidden. The days were blistering, the nights cold. Yet each morning and evening, without fail, black-winged ravens swept through the sky, carrying bread and meat in their beaks. Carrion birds, once symbols of death, became instruments of divine provision. Elijah ate. He drank from the cool stream. And he waited. Alone with the sound of trickling water and rustling leaves, the prophet learned patience. The chaos of palaces was far behind him. The noise of idol worship, the cries of the innocent, the cackling of false priests, it all faded. There was only the voice of the wind and the rhythm of obedience. Days turned to weeks. Then months. The drought deepened. Crops shriveled. Cisterns cracked. People begged their false gods for mercy, but the skies remained sealed. And eventually, even Korath began to wither. Elijah watched the brook recede, inch by inch, until only pebbles remained where water once flowed. He crouched, touching the dry bed, the cracks beneath his fingers matching those forming in the soul of Israel. Yet he did not panic. Jehovah had spoken once, and he would speak again. As the brook at Korath dried to silence, Jehovah's voice stirred again, guiding Elijah northward, into dangerous territory. "Arise," God said. "Go to Zarephath in Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to sustain you." Zarephath was not in Israel. It was enemy land, deep in Jezebel's own pagan homeland. Yet God sent his prophet right into the heart of Baal's domain to reveal a miracle not just for Israel, but for all who would believe. Weary and cloaked in dust, Elijah arrived at the city gates and found her, a frail woman gathering sticks, her eyes hollow with hunger, her movements slow. He called out, "Bring me a little water in a vessel, that I may drink." She turned to comply. Then he added, "And bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." At that, the woman stopped and spoke with the raw voice of the desperate. "As Jehovah your God lives," she said, "I have nothing baked. Only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am gathering 2 sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it, and die." Elijah looked at her, not with pity, but with quiet certainty. "Do not be afraid. Go and do as you have said, but first make me a small cake of it and bring it to me. Then make something for yourself and your son. For thus says Jehovah, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not run dry until the day Jehovah sends rain upon the earth." The woman hesitated, but then obeyed. And from that moment, the miracle began. Each day she reached into the jar, and there was flour. Each day she poured from the jug, and there was oil. It never overflowed. It never ran dry. Just enough. Day after day. Life was preserved in the land of death. And yet, as peace returned to their home, tragedy knocked again. One day, without warning, the widow's son collapsed. His breathing ceased. His body went limp. Her screams tore through the house as she cradled his lifeless form. "What have you against me, O man of God?" she cried. "Have you come to bring my sin to remembrance and cause the death of my son?" Elijah took the boy's body from her arms and climbed to the upper chamber. He laid the child on the bed and cried out to Jehovah. "O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I sojourn, by killing her son?" Then he stretched himself over the child 3 times, pleading, "O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again." Silence. And then, a breath. The child gasped. His eyes opened. Life surged back into him. Elijah carried him downstairs, alive. The widow wept and whispered, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of Jehovah in your mouth is truth." The room was still heavy with the scent of grief when Elijah descended the stairs, the boy alive in his arms. The widow stood frozen, her hands trembling, eyes wide in disbelief as her son breathed against the prophet's shoulder. Moments ago, her world had crumbled. Now, it stood resurrected. Elijah gently placed the boy back into her embrace. No grand speech, no dramatic flair, just a quiet return of what had been lost. And in that silence, the woman whispered words more powerful than thunder. "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of Jehovah in your mouth is truth." It was more than gratitude, it was confession, revelation, surrender. In a land soaked with false gods and dead promises, here, in a pagan region, stood a living testimony to Jehovah's power. The miracle was not just for the woman or her child. It was a declaration to the entire region that the God of Israel was not confined to borders or temples. He was not a tribal deity, but the sovereign over life and death itself. Elijah had not only been sustained through drought and ravens, but now had been the vessel through which resurrection touched foreign soil. And yet, the journey was far from over. Even with the boy alive, even with the widow's faith restored, the sky remained empty. No rain fell. The earth cracked deeper. Israel still groaned under the weight of divine silence. But that silence was not absence, it was the coiling of something greater. In the quiet before the storm, God was setting the stage for a reckoning no king or idol could escape. Elijah would soon leave this house of mercy and walk into the fire of confrontation. The next time he spoke, it would be before thousands, and heaven itself would answer with flames. Years had passed since Elijah first spoke the drought into existence, and not a single drop of rain had touched Israel's parched ground. The land groaned under the curse. Fields once ripe with grain now lay cracked and dead. Livestock perished. Wells dried to dust. And still, no repentance. No turning back to Jehovah. Desperation swept across the kingdom like a plague. In the royal court, Ahab grew increasingly bitter, while Jezebel tightened her grip on power, silencing the prophets of Jehovah one by one. Many were slain. Others, like Obadiah, the king's own steward, secretly hid them in caves, risking death to preserve the truth. It was in this chaos that Jehovah again spoke to Elijah. Go, show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth. Obedient, the prophet emerged from exile and approached Obadiah, who trembled at the sight of him. Is it really you, my lord Elijah? He whispered. Elijah nodded, his eyes fierce but calm. Go tell your master, Elijah is here. Fear flickered in Obadiah's eyes. If I leave and the Spirit carries you away, Ahab will kill me. But Elijah reassured him. As the Lord of hosts lives, I will surely show myself to him today. Word was sent. The moment long feared by Ahab had come. On a dusty road outside the ruins of a withered vineyard, the two men stood face to face. Ahab's royal garb was tarnished by dust, his crown dulled by sun and failure. His eyes, bloodshot from sleepless rage, locked onto the prophet. Is it you, troubler of Israel? He hissed. Elijah stepped forward without hesitation. I have not troubled Israel, he said with a calmness that stung. But you have, you and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of Jehovah and followed the Baals. The words struck like stone. Ahab's mouth opened to retaliate, but Elijah didn't flinch. He raised his voice for all nearby to hear. Now summon all Israel to meet me at Mount Carmel. Bring the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. It was not a request. It was a challenge. The ground beneath them seemed to pulse. Ahab didn't realize it yet, but he was no longer the one in control. A trial was coming. Not in courtrooms or temples, but on a mountain. And the judge would not be a man, but the God who answers by fire. The sun rose high and merciless over Mount Carmel as a restless crowd assembled. Thousands of Israelites gathered from every corner of the land, their eyes sunken with drought, their hearts torn between fear and disbelief. Soldiers stood at the edges, uneasy. Royal officials whispered among themselves. And at the mountain's peak, 2 altars waited, one for Baal, one for Jehovah. On one side, 450 prophets of Baal, cloaked in crimson, chanting and swaying like reeds in the wind. On the other, a solitary figure in a tattered cloak, Elijah, standing tall, unmoved. The prophet's voice thundered across the mountainside, slicing through the murmur like a sword. How long will you waver between 2 opinions? If Jehovah is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. The people remained silent. Not a single voice answered. Not even a whisper. Elijah set the rules: 2 bulls, 2 altars, no fire. You call upon the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of Jehovah. The God who answers by fire, he is God. The prophets of Baal eagerly prepared their altar, laying the wood, cutting the bull, arranging everything with priestly flair. Then they began to cry out, O Baal, answer us. Morning into noon, voices rising into frantic shrieks. They danced. They spun. They cut themselves with swords and lances until blood flowed down their robes. Hours passed. The sun blazed overhead. The altar remained still. No voice. No fire. No answer. Elijah leaned casually against a rock, watching. Then, with a smirk, he stood and mocked them. Shout louder. He is a god, isn't he? Maybe he's deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Perhaps he's asleep and must be awakened. The crowd laughed nervously, but the prophets only screamed louder, bloodied and exhausted. As the sun began to sink, Elijah stood up. It was his turn. He repaired Jehovah's broken altar using 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel. He dug a trench around it, laid wood upon the stones, placed the bull atop, and then did the unthinkable. He drenched the entire altar with water. 3 times he ordered jars poured out, until water filled the trench and soaked the sacrifice. Then, with no shouting, no frenzy, Elijah stepped forward and lifted his eyes to heaven. O Jehovah, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, he prayed, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant. Answer me, Lord, so these people may know that you are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. And in that moment, fire fell. A column of flame roared down from the heavens, devouring the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the water, and even the dust beneath the altar. The mountain trembled. The crowd screamed and fell to their faces, wailing, Jehovah, he is God. Jehovah, he is God. No doubt remained. Baal was silent. But Jehovah had spoken, with fire. The smoke still curled from the charred stones of Jehovah's altar when Elijah turned to the crowd, his voice now filled with urgency and command. Seize the prophets of Baal, he declared. Let not one of them escape. And the people, awakened by the display of divine fire, surged like a flood. One by one, the false prophets were captured and taken to the brook Kishon below, where justice was delivered. The blood that had once been shed in deception now cried out from the earth as a final cleansing. But Elijah was not finished. With the weight of heaven still pressing down, he turned to King Ahab and said, Go up, eat and drink, for there is the sound of rushing rain. Ahab, stunned and silent, obeyed, retreating to his chariot. Meanwhile, Elijah climbed back up to the peak of Carmel. Alone now, he bowed low, placing his face between his knees, a position not of pride, but of deep, desperate intercession. Though fire had fallen, the drought still lingered. Elijah knew, the same God who answered by fire would soon answer by rain. He sent his servant toward the sea, commanding him, Go now, and look toward the horizon. The servant ran, scanned the skies, and returned. There is nothing, he said. Elijah nodded, said nothing, and remained in prayer. Again and again, 7 times in total, he sent the servant to look. Each time, the sky was empty. Each time, Elijah remained face to the ground, refusing to give up. Finally, on the 7th time, the servant returned with wonder in his eyes. Behold, a cloud, small as a man's hand, is rising from the sea. Elijah rose at once, his cloak whipping in the wind. He turned to his servant. Go. Say to Ahab, Prepare your chariot and go down before the rain stops you. And then, it came. The sky, once still and silent, turned black with clouds. The wind howled through the trees. And a torrential downpour burst forth over the land, like heaven itself exhaled. The drought was over. Rain pelted the earth with fury and mercy. Ahab raced his chariot toward Jezreel, but Elijah, fueled not by strength but by the Spirit of the Lord, ran ahead of him, cloak flying, feet pounding the soaked earth. The prophet who once prayed alone on a mountaintop now outran horses through the storm. Fire had fallen. Rain had returned. But a greater storm was coming, one not of weather, but of vengeance. Jezebel had seen enough. And her wrath was only just beginning. The storm had barely passed when Elijah arrived at the gates of Jezreel, drenched in victory and rain. The prophet, once a hunted man, had now turned the tide of a nation. Fire had answered his call, the people had bowed to Jehovah, and the long drought was broken. But in the shadows of the palace, darkness stirred. word of what happened on Mount Carmel reached Queen Jezebel before Elijah could even dry his cloak. Her prophets, her pride, her instruments of Baal, were gone. Slaughtered. Disgraced. And her grip on the throne was threatened. She did not wail or mourn. She did not pray. She issued a sentence. Cold. Direct. Deadly. A messenger was sent at once to Elijah, bearing a single threat sealed with the fury of a queen. So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. It wasn't just a death threat, it was a vow, a curse, a royal declaration that Elijah would not live to see another sunrise. The man who faced down kings, called fire from heaven, and split the skies with his prayers suddenly crumbled. Terror gripped his heart. This wasn't divine judgment. This was personal, venomous, relentless wrath. Elijah fled. Not to regroup or confront, but to escape. He ran for his life, down through Judah, across the wilderness, collapsing beneath a solitary broom tree. There, with no crowd, no altar, no miracle to stir him, Elijah finally broke. "It is enough," he whispered. "Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." Exhausted, heartbroken, and spiritually empty, the prophet lay in the dust and begged to die. The great man of fire, now smoldering embers. But Jehovah was not finished with him. Not yet. Elijah lay curled beneath the broom tree, the desert wind brushing sand across his face like ash on a mourner's forehead. His voice was hoarse from weeping, his soul hollowed out from the weight of purpose. He had given everything, confronted a king, defied a queen, called down fire from heaven, and still, it wasn't enough. The nation's heart had not changed. Jezebel still ruled. Fear had found its way into the marrow of even God's prophet. And so he prayed not for strength, but for death. "It is enough," he had said. "Let me die." Then silence. But Jehovah had not abandoned him. In the heat of his despair, a soft presence moved beside him. An angel of the Lord touched his shoulder and said gently, "Arise and eat." Elijah opened his eyes and found, to his astonishment, a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water at his head. Heaven had answered, not with rebuke, but with bread. He ate in silence, then lay back down, still too weary to hope. A second time, the angel returned, touched him again. "Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you." Elijah obeyed, and this time, the meal did more than nourish, it revived his resolve. Strength surged back into his limbs. Sustained by the bread of heaven, Elijah rose and began to walk. 40 days and 40 nights he traveled through barren land, across jagged valleys and lifeless hills, pressing on toward the sacred mountain, Horeb, the mountain of God. It was not escape he sought now, but encounter. Somewhere in the vast silence of that holy place, he would search for the voice he could no longer hear clearly. What he didn't yet know was that Jehovah wasn't waiting in the thunder or fire, but in something far more intimate. The journey ended at a cave carved into the side of Mount Horeb, the same mountain where Moses once stood trembling before a burning bush, where commandments were carved into stone by the very hand of God. Elijah, weathered and worn, entered the cave and collapsed into its cold silence. Night fell. Then came the voice, not in thunder, but in question. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It was not accusation, it was invitation. Elijah poured out his anguish. "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts," he cried. "The people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away." Then Jehovah said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before me." Elijah stepped into the mouth of the cave. Suddenly, a violent wind tore across the peaks, splitting rocks and shaking the very bones of the mountain. But Jehovah was not in the wind. Then an earthquake shook the ground beneath him, rolling stones and ripping open the earth. But Jehovah was not in the earthquake. Then fire roared down the mountainside, fierce, untamed, and wild. But Jehovah was not in the fire. Then, finally, a sound so soft it couldn't be called a sound at all. A still, small voice. A whisper. And Elijah wrapped his mantle around his face and stepped forward. Because now, Jehovah was near. Not in the spectacle, not in the shaking, but in intimacy, in presence, in breath. Again the voice asked, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And again Elijah spoke of his isolation, his fear, his perceived failure. But this time, God responded not with thunder or rebuke, but with a plan. "Go," he said. "Return to your way. Anoint Hazael king over Syria, and Jehu over Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, as prophet in your place." And then, one final truth, one final lifeline for the prophet's weary heart. "Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." Elijah wasn't alone. He never had been. The silence had been full of God all along. And with that whisper, the man of fire found the strength to rise again. With renewed clarity and divine direction, Elijah descended from Horeb, no longer a man running from death but a prophet walking in obedience. His next assignment lay not in palaces or on mountaintops, but in a field. Far from the noise of kings and prophets, a young man named Elisha was plowing 12 yoke of oxen across a dusty stretch of land in Abel Meholah. His hands were calloused, his back strong, and his spirit steady. He was no priest, no mystic, just a farmer, until that moment. Elijah approached without a word, eyes locked on the horizon, and cast his mantle upon Elisha's shoulders as he passed. The rough, sun-worn cloth, still heavy with the scent of wilderness and fire, slid over Elisha's back like a crown. It was not a greeting. It was a calling. Elisha froze. He knew what it meant. Without hesitation, he ran after Elijah. "Let me first kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow you," he said. Elijah turned, voice calm, almost distant. "Go back again, for what have I done to you?" But Elisha understood. This was no invitation to delay. It was a test of resolve. So Elisha returned to his oxen, but not to keep them. He slaughtered them, used the wooden yoke as fuel, and cooked the meat to feed the people. He didn't sell the tools. He didn't bury them for later. He burned his past so there would be no turning back. Then he rose, leaving behind his land, his family, his livelihood, and followed Elijah to become his servant. Side by side, the old prophet and the new apprentice walked into a world on fire, one seasoned by divine fury, the other forged in quiet obedience. A mantle had shifted. The future of prophecy now rested not only on the one who called fire from the sky, but on the one who would one day bear that fire himself. Time passed, and while Elisha followed and served Elijah faithfully, the corruption in Israel's throne room deepened. Ahab, though momentarily humbled by the fire on Mount Carmel, had not truly repented. His greed soon led him to yet another abomination, one that would stain the soil of Jezreel with innocent blood. Naboth, a simple man, owned a vineyard beside the king's palace. It had belonged to his ancestors and he guarded it with honor. But Ahab wanted it, not as a place of worship or necessity, but as a garden for his own pleasure. He offered money. Naboth refused. "Jehovah forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers," he said firmly. Ahab sulked back to the palace like a spoiled child, lying on his bed, refusing to eat. Jezebel entered, her voice dripping with scorn. "Do you now govern Israel?" she sneered. And then she took matters into her own hands. She forged letters in the king's name, summoned false witnesses, and arranged for Naboth to be accused of blasphemy. The judgment was swift. The sentence, death by stoning. And so, the innocent man was dragged from his home and murdered by the very leaders sworn to uphold justice. Blood soaked the vineyard soil. Word reached Jezebel. With a cold smile, she turned to her husband. "Arise," she said. "Take possession of the vineyard of Naboth, for he is no more." But before Ahab could even rejoice, Elijah was already on his way. Cloaked in fury and righteousness, the prophet appeared in the vineyard, the scent of death still lingering in the air. Ahab's face twisted when he saw him. "Have you found me, O my enemy?" he asked bitterly. Elijah stepped forward, voice like stone. I have found you, he said, because you have sold yourself to do what is evil in the sight of Jehovah. Then came the judgment. The dogs would lick Ahab's blood in the very place they licked Naboth's. Jezebel, too, would meet a brutal, shameful end. And their descendants would be cut off. The vineyard had become more than stolen land. It was a crime scene, a prophecy, a graveyard of innocence. And Elijah's voice, once again, echoed with divine justice in a land that had long forgotten what justice meant. The years flowed like the Jordan itself, and though Elijah continued his ministry, he knew the end of his earthly journey was near. The time had come not for death, but for departure. Unlike other prophets, Elijah would not taste the grave. A different exit awaited him. The Lord had revealed to him that he would be taken up, and the weight of that mystery hung heavy in the air. He rose early, calling Elisha to follow him one last time. They walked from Gilgal to Bethel, then to Jericho, each stop echoing with history and sacred memory. At every city the sons of the prophets came out and whispered to Elisha, "Do you know that the Lord will take your master from you today?" And each time, Elisha nodded, eyes fixed ahead. "Yes, I know." Keep silent. His heart was full, his spirit bracing for goodbye, but he refused to leave Elijah's side. When they finally reached the banks of the Jordan River, 50 prophets stood at a distance, watching. Elijah, with steady hands, took his warm mantle, folded it, and struck the water. Instantly the river parted, just as it had for Joshua, just as it had for Moses. The two men crossed over on dry ground, a final miracle shared between master and apprentice. On the other side, Elijah turned to Elisha and asked the question that would define a legacy. "What shall I do for you before I am taken from you?" Elisha didn't hesitate. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," he said boldly. Elijah's eyes searched his. "You have asked a hard thing," he replied. "But if you see me as I am being taken from you, it shall be so." And so they walked on, not knowing the exact moment, but knowing it would be soon. The earth itself seemed to hush in anticipation. The river behind them, the heavens above them, and the weight of the mantle between them. A parting was coming, but it would not be with death, nor with sorrow. It would be with fire. The wind shifted. The ground, still beneath their feet only moments before, seemed to tremble with invisible power. Then it happened, suddenly, without warning nor sound. From the heavens roared a chariot of fire, pulled by horses of flame, blazing with a light not of this world. It descended between them, not gently, but like a divine storm unleashed. A whirlwind erupted, lifting dust and light and power into a spinning column that wrapped itself around Elijah. Elisha staggered back, shielding his eyes, his heart pounding with awe and terror. He saw his master, his teacher, his spiritual father, lifted from the earth, caught up into the sky by the chariot of fire, his mantle flaring like a comet's tail. Elisha cried out, not in panic but in heartbreak, "My father! My father! The chariots of Israel and its horsemen!" For Elijah had been more than a prophet. He had been the strength and defense of the nation, its unseen shield. And now, that shield was rising into the heavens. Then silence. The whirlwind was gone. The chariot disappeared beyond sight. The sky returned to stillness. All that remained was the prophet's mantle, Elijah's cloak, slowly drifting back to earth like a falling star. Elisha tore his own garments in two, grief and reverence pouring from his soul. But he did not remain in sorrow. He stepped forward, picked up the mantle of Elijah, and stood at the edge of the Jordan. The same river they had crossed just moments ago now waited to test the new prophet. Elisha took the mantle, struck the water, and cried out, not in arrogance, but in longing, "Where now is Jehovah, the God of Elijah?" For a moment, nothing. Then the waters trembled and parted once more. Elisha crossed on dry ground. The 50 prophets watching from afar fell silent. They saw it. The spirit of Elijah now rested upon Elisha. The fire had not ended with Elijah, it had transferred. The journey of the second prophet had just begun. Elisha returned across the Jordan, But he was not the same man who had followed Elijah with wide eyes and a servant's heart. Something had shifted. The mantle he now carried was not just a cloak, it was a declaration. The Spirit of the Lord, once poured out upon Elijah, now burned within him. As he approached Jericho, the sons of the prophets came out to meet him, their eyes scanning his face, searching for proof of what they had feared and hoped. And when they bowed before him, it was not in worship, but in recognition. "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha," they whispered. Still, some doubted. 50 men begged to search the hills for Elijah's body, convinced he had merely been cast aside by the whirlwind. Elisha, knowing better, told them not to go. But they insisted. After 3 days of searching, they returned empty-handed. Elisha said nothing. He didn't need to. His calling spoke louder than argument. But the time for signs was not over. The men of Jericho came to him next, pleading. "The water here is bad," they said. "The land is unfruitful." Elisha asked for a new bowl filled with salt. He walked to the spring and threw the salt into it, declaring, "Thus says the Lord, I have healed this water. From now on neither death nor miscarriage shall come from it." And just like that, the water became pure. Life returned to the land. It was a small miracle, but it was a beginning. Yet not all would revere him. As Elisha journeyed toward Bethel, a mob of young men emerged from the town, mocking him. "Go up, you bald head! Go up!" they jeered, laughing in cruel defiance. They weren't just mocking Elisha, they were mocking the mantle, the calling, the very God who had taken Elijah up. Elisha turned, cursed them in the name of the Lord, and from the forest came 2 bears, fierce and swift. The laughter died in screams. It was a harsh reminder. The prophetic office was not a game, and God would not be mocked. The rise of Elisha had begun not with grandeur, but with judgment, healing, and a mantle tested by scorn. He was not a second Elijah. He was something different. And his journey would blaze its own path through fire, mercy, and power. Word of Elisha's miracles began to spread, not just among prophets and kings, but among the forgotten and desperate, those who lived in the margins, whose names never appeared in royal scrolls but who cried out day and night for mercy. One such voice reached Elisha, a widow, broken by loss and crushed by debt. Her husband had been one of the sons of the prophets, faithful to Jehovah, but his death left her vulnerable. Now the creditor had come, threatening to take her 2 sons as slaves to repay what was owed. She stood before Elisha with trembling hands and tear-stained cheeks, not demanding a miracle, but pleading for justice. Elisha looked at her not as a burden, but as a daughter of the covenant. "What shall I do for you?" he asked gently. "Tell me, what do you have in your house?" She answered, "Your servant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil." That was all Elisha needed. "Go," he said. "Borrow vessels from all your neighbors, empty vessels, and not too few. Then go in, shut the door behind you and your sons, and pour into all those vessels. And when one is full, set it aside." The woman obeyed, her sons gathering every jar, bowl, and container they could find. Behind closed doors, the miracle began. She tilted the small jar of oil, and it flowed. Into the first vessel, then the second, then the third. The stream didn't slow. It didn't stop. The jar in her hands never emptied. It kept pouring as though heaven itself had filled it. Her sons handed her vessel after vessel, eyes wide with awe, until the last container was brimming. She turned and asked, "Bring me another." But they answered, "There is not another." And then the oil stopped. Not because God's power ran out, but because the vessels had. She came back to Elisha, who smiled and said, "Go, sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on the rest." What began as a cry for rescue ended in overflowing provision. Elisha had not just saved a family, he had reminded an entire nation that the God of Israel saw the hidden ones, heard their cries, and could turn emptiness into abundance with a single jar of oil. As Elisha continued his ministry, he often traveled through the region of Shunem, a quiet town nestled among the hills. There lived a prominent woman there, wealthy, respected, yet burdened with a sorrow no riches could heal. She had no child. Her home was large, her table full, but her womb remained empty. Yet she recognized the presence of God when she saw it. Each time Elisha passed through, she urged him to eat, offering him rest and hospitality without condition. Over time, her care deepened into reverence. She turned to her husband and said, "I perceive that this is a holy man of God who passes by us regularly. Let us make a small room on the roof with a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp for him, so that whenever he comes to us, he can stay there." And so it was done. A room, humble, quiet, sacred, built not out of obligation, but devotion. One day, as Elisha lay in that upper room, he called his servant Gehazi and said, "Call the Shunammite woman." She stood in the doorway as Elisha asked, "You have gone to all this trouble for us. What can be done for you? Shall I speak to the king or the commander of the army on your behalf?" But she answered simply, "I dwell among my own people." She didn't ask for anything. But Elisha saw what she wouldn't say. Gehazi whispered, "She has no son, and her husband is old." Then Elisha looked at her and declared, "At this time next year, you shall embrace a son." Her composure cracked. She gasped, eyes wide, heart pounding. "No, my lord," she cried. "Man of God, do not lie to your servant." But the word had been spoken. And 1 year later, her arms cradled the impossible, a child of promise, born not from hope but from prophecy. In a quiet town, in a hidden room, the Spirit of God had reached down and planted life where emptiness had long lived. Elisha had not only passed through her home, he had left behind a miracle. But miracles, like seeds, sometimes pass through seasons of testing. And what had bloomed in joy would soon be brought to the edge of sorrow once more. The promised child grew, strong and full of life, his laughter filling the once quiet home in Shunem. The barren woman who had once wept in silence now watched her son run through fields, his footsteps a constant reminder that nothing is impossible for Jehovah. But one harvest morning, as the boy followed his father into the fields, something changed. The sunlight was bright, the air hot, and suddenly the child clutched his head and cried out in pain. "My head! My head!" His father, alarmed but unsure, told the servant, "Carry him to his mother." The boy was brought home and laid in her arms. She held him, rocked him, whispered every prayer she knew. But by noon, the child died in her lap. No scream escaped her lips. No tears were wasted. This was not a woman defeated by grief. This was a woman who had seen God move before, and she would not accept death without a fight. With determined steps, she carried her son upstairs to the very room Elisha had stayed in, the sacred space built for a prophet, and laid the boy gently on the prophet's bed. She didn't call for mourners. She didn't prepare a burial. She saddled a donkey and told her servant, "Drive forward. Do not slow down unless I tell you." When her husband asked why she was going to the man of God, she simply replied, "All is well." But inside, her soul was racing. She journeyed to Mount Carmel, where Elisha was staying. From a distance, he saw her approaching and sent Gehazi to ask if everything was all right. Her answer was the same. "All is well." But when she reached Elisha, she fell at his feet, gripping him with a grief too deep for words. Gehazi tried to push her away, but Elisha stopped him. "Leave her," he said. "Her soul is in deep distress, and the Lord has hidden it from me." Then the truth poured out. "Did I ask my Lord for a son? Did I not say, 'Do not deceive me'?" Elisha, stunned and moved, gave his staff to Gehazi. "Go quickly," he said. "Lay my staff on the boy's face." But the mother refused to leave Elisha's side. "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So Elisha rose and followed her. When Gehazi arrived first and laid the staff on the boy, nothing happened. No sound. No sign. No breath. But when Elisha arrived, he went alone into the room, shut the door, and prayed to the Lord. Then he stretched himself out upon the child, eyes to eyes, hands to hands, mouth to mouth. The boy's flesh grew warm. Elisha got up, walked back and forth in the room, then repeated the act again. Suddenly, the boy sneezed. Once. Twice. 7 times. And then his eyes opened. Elisha called for the mother. She entered, trembling. "Take your son," he said. She fell to the floor in reverent awe, then rose and embraced the boy who had once died in her arms but now stood alive, restored not just by a prophet, but by a faithful God who hears even unspoken cries. In the upper room where promise had been born, death was defeated, and life had the final word. As Elisha's reputation grew across Israel, so did the desperation of the people. The famine in the land was fierce, crops had failed, herds had thinned, and hunger gnawed at every corner of the nation. Yet wherever Elisha went, provision followed. One day, while staying at the school of the prophets in Gilgal, a group of young disciples gathered around him, their faces sunken with hunger. Elisha turned to his servant and said, "Set on the large pot, and boil stew for the sons of the prophets." The servant obeyed. But as one of the young men went out into the field to gather herbs, he unknowingly collected wild gourds, unfamiliar, toxic, deadly. He sliced them into the stew pot, unaware of the danger he had just introduced. The food was served. No sooner had the first bites been swallowed than cries rang out from around the table. "O man of God, there is death in the pot!" Panic spread. What had been a gift had become a curse. But Elisha remained calm. He asked for flour, simple, ordinary flour, and threw it into the pot. "Serve it to the people," he said. And as they ate again, the poison was gone. The stew no longer brought death but life. In a time of famine, God turned a fatal mistake into a miracle through the quiet faith of his prophet. But the provision did not stop there. Soon after, a man came from Elisha, bringing Elisha 20 loaves of barley bread and fresh grain, an offering for the prophet. It was a generous gift, but the group of hungry students gathered around numbered 100 men. Elisha looked at the bread and simply said, "Give it to the people, that they may eat." His servant hesitated. "How can I set this before 100 men?" Elisha didn't flinch. "Give it to them," he repeated. "For thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left." The bread was passed out. Mouths filled. Bellies were satisfied. And just as the Lord had said, there was food left over. In the middle of drought, in the face of death, God showed he could still multiply the little, purify the poisoned, and feed his faithful. Through Elisha, the God of provision had made himself known, not just in fire or storms, but in flour, in bread, and in every small miracle that quietly defeated despair. Far beyond Israel's borders, in the land of Syria, lived a man named Naaman, a commander of great power, a war hero, favored by his king and feared by his enemies. He was strong, noble, and victorious. But beneath the polished armor and military acclaim was a secret he could not outrun. Naaman was a leper. The disease crept silently across his skin, a slow decay that no sword could defeat. Desperation eventually led him to a surprising source. A young Israelite girl, captured during a Syrian raid and now a servant in Naaman's household, spoke of a prophet in Samaria, one who could heal. Her words reached Naaman's ears like a flicker of hope. With his king's blessing and royal letters in hand, Naaman traveled to Israel with silver, gold, and 10 changes of garments, seeking healing through prestige and gifts. He arrived at Elisha's house, expecting a prophet to come out, wave his hand, and perform some dramatic ritual. But Elisha didn't even step outside. Instead, he sent a simple message through his servant. "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." The words struck Naaman like an insult. He was enraged. "I thought he would surely come out to me," he fumed. "Are not the rivers of Damascus better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" He turned away in fury, humiliated. But then, reason came from humility. His own servants approached him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more then, when he says, 'Wash and be clean'?" Their words cut deeper than any wound. Naaman paused, turned, and humbled himself. He went to the Jordan River, a muddy, unimpressive stream compared to the proud rivers of Syria. He stepped in. Once. Twice. 3 times. His pride washed away layer by layer. 4. 5. 6. Still no change. Then, on the 7th time, he rose from the water, and his skin was restored like the flesh of a child. He was clean. Overwhelmed, Naaman returned to Elisha, a different man, not just in body, but in spirit. "Now I know," he said, "that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel." He tried to offer gifts, but Elisha refused. Healing was not for sale. It was grace. And though Naaman returned to Syria, he carried with him more than health. He carried the name of Jehovah in his heart, proof that the living God was not confined to borders, temples, or tribes. And all of it began with a servant's faith and a prophet's message that the path to healing runs through humility. The miracle of Naaman's healing should have ended with glory to God and gratitude from a foreign heart transformed. But not everyone near Elisha shared the same integrity. Gehazi, Elisha's servant, who had witnessed countless acts of mercy, who had heard the word of God spoken with power, allowed a seed of greed to take root in his heart. As Naaman departed, having offered silver, gold, and fine garments in thanks, Elisha had firmly refused. "As surely as the Lord lives, I will accept nothing," he had said. Grace was never for sale. But Gehazi couldn't let go. He waited until Naaman's caravan disappeared into the horizon, then chased after him in secret. When Naaman saw him approaching, he stopped, concerned. "Is all well?" he asked. Gehazi nodded, already wrapped in lies. "All is well," he said smoothly. "My master has sent me to say, 2 young men of the sons of the prophets have come from the hill country. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothing." Naaman, eager to give, offered even more, 2 talents of silver in 2 bags and the clothing Gehazi had asked for. He sent them back with Gehazi's servants, unaware of the deception. Once back, Gehazi hid the goods inside the house before returning to Elisha as if nothing had happened. But prophets see more than appearances. Elisha looked at him and asked, "Where have you been, Gehazi?" Gehazi answered, "Your servant went nowhere." Then Elisha's eyes narrowed, and his voice turned to thunder. "Was not my spirit with you when the man turned from his chariot to meet you? Is this the time to accept money and garments, olive orchards and vineyards, sheep and oxen, male servants and female servants?" The silence was suffocating. Then came the judgment, swift, righteous, irreversible. "Therefore the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and to your descendants forever." And in that moment, Gehazi's skin turned white as snow. He backed away in horror, marked by the very disease from which Elisha had refused payment. What should have been a story of redemption became a warning carved into flesh. You cannot profit from grace, and you cannot outrun the gaze of a holy God. Elisha had inherited a mantle of power, but he had also inherited a burden, to stand for the purity of God's name, even when those closest to him fell. Gehazi walked away leprous and alone, a man who had chosen silver over truth, and paid for it with his soul. Not every miracle Elisha performed shook mountains or brought kings to their knees. Some were quiet, almost hidden, proof that Jehovah was not only the God of fire and flood, but the God who cares about borrowed tools and anxious hearts. One such moment unfolded near the banks of the Jordan River, where the sons of the prophets were building a new dwelling place. Their numbers had grown, and space had grown tight. It was a simple construction effort, woodcutting, teamwork, sweat under the sun. But amid the labor, a cry pierced the air. One of the men, swinging an axe, had watched in horror as the iron head flew from the handle and disappeared into the river below with a dull splash. He panicked. "Alas, my master!" he cried out to Elisha. "It was borrowed." To most, it was a small thing, a tool lost, an inconvenience. But not to God. Elisha, calm and present as always, asked where it had fallen. The young man pointed to the water. Elisha took a stick, broke it from a nearby tree, and threw it into the river at the exact spot. Then, before the man's disbelieving eyes, the impossible happened. the iron floated. It rose slowly to the surface, heavy metal defying gravity, bobbing like a leaf. "Pick it up," Elisha said simply. And the man reached out, hand trembling, and took it. No great crowd saw the miracle. No king sent a letter of thanks. But in that moment, heaven stooped low to meet a student's need. Through Elisha, God revealed a truth Israel often forgot. He was not distant or aloof. He saw. He cared. He moved, even in the smallest things. In a world of plagues and wars, kingdoms and famines, the God of Israel still heard the cry of one man who had lost something borrowed. And he answered not with fire, but with floating iron. War drums echoed through the land once more. The king of Syria, enraged by Israel's evasive strategies, suspected a traitor among his ranks. Time and again, his ambushes failed. Israel's army always seemed one step ahead. Finally, one of his servants spoke the truth he feared. "None of us, my lord king, are betraying you. But Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the very words you speak in your bedroom." The king's face twisted in fury. "Find him," he ordered. "Capture him." Word came that Elisha was in Dothan, a quiet town surrounded by hills. Under the cover of night, the Syrian army moved in, chariots, horses, soldiers by the hundreds, circling the city while it slept. At dawn, Elisha's servant stepped outside and froze. The hills were swarming with enemy forces, blades catching the early sun. Panic seized him. He rushed back inside. "Alas, my master! What shall we do?" Elisha, unfazed, rose calmly and looked outside. Then he smiled, not with arrogance, but with quiet confidence in the unseen. "Do not be afraid," he said. "For those who are with us are more than those who are with them." The servant blinked, confused. All he could see were enemies. Then Elisha prayed, "O Lord, please open his eyes that he may see." And in that instant, the servant's vision was unveiled. What he saw next stole his breath. The hills, those same hills filled with enemy chariots, were now lit with a heavenly fire. Surrounding the Syrians was a greater army, chariots of flame, warriors of light, a celestial host ready for battle. The armies of heaven had been there all along, hidden until faith opened human eyes to divine reality. Then Elisha prayed again, but this time for the enemy. "Strike them with blindness." And God did. Confused and disoriented, the soldiers stumbled forward, unable to see clearly. Elisha led them straight into Samaria, into the heart of Israel's capital. When the king of Israel saw them, he asked, "Shall I strike them down?" But Elisha shook his head. "Would you kill those you've taken captive with sword and bow? Set bread and water before them, that they may eat and drink and go back to their master." And so a feast was laid. The blind were fed, their sight restored, and they returned home without bloodshed. The raid stopped, for a time. But more than a victory, the moment became a message. The God of Israel did not always destroy his enemies. Sometimes, he overwhelmed them with mercy. And always, he fought battles that human eyes could barely begin to see. The city of Samaria was dying. The Syrians had returned, not in confusion this time, but in brutal force. Their armies laid siege to Israel's capital, choking off supplies, starving its people into despair. Inside the city walls, desperation mutated into madness. Food vanished. Then came the unthinkable. Dove dung sold for silver, a donkey's head fetched a king's ransom, and worst of all, whispers spread of cannibalism in the night. The king of Israel, robes torn in grief, walked the walls in silence until rage overtook him. He vowed to kill Elisha, blaming the prophet for the suffering. Messengers were sent, soldiers followed, but Elisha, calm and composed, already knew they were coming. He sat with the elders of the city and said, "Do you see how this murderer has sent someone to take off my head?" But before the executioner could reach him, the king arrived. Frustrated, broken, he groaned, "This disaster is from the Lord. Why should I wait for him any longer?" And in that moment, Elisha stood, not to plead, but to prophesy. "Hear the word of the Lord," he declared. "Thus says Jehovah, tomorrow, about this time, A measure of fine flour will be sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel, at the gate of Samaria." The royal officer beside the king scoffed. "Even if the Lord opened the windows of heaven, could this thing be?" Elisha looked at him coldly. "You shall see it with your eyes, but you shall not eat of it." That same night, 4 lepers stood at the gate, men outcast from the city, discarded by society, left to die slowly. But as hunger gnawed at their bellies, one of them said, "Why stay here until we die? If we enter the city, we die. If we stay here, we die. Let's go to the camp of the Syrians. If they kill us, we die. But they may spare us." And so they rose in the dark and made their way to the enemy camp. But as they approached, the Lord had already gone before them. The Syrians had heard something no man caused, a great noise of chariots, of horses, of a massive army approaching. Terrified, they believed Egypt and the Hittites had come to Israel's aid. Panic swept through the camp, and they fled in the night, leaving behind food, gold, clothing, tents, everything. When the lepers arrived, they found the camp abandoned, the tables still set, food still warm. They ate, drank, and filled their arms with treasure. Then one of them paused. "This is a day of good news, and we are keeping it to ourselves. If we wait until morning, punishment will overtake us. Let us go and tell the king's household." And so they did. At first, the king suspected a trap, but once the truth was confirmed, the people surged out of the city like a flood. They plundered the camp, and just as Elisha had said, fine flour and barley sold at the gate for a shekel. But in the chaos, the royal officer who had mocked the prophecy stood at the gate to control the crowd. Trampled underfoot, he died, just as the word of the Lord had declared. He saw the miracle, but never tasted it. In the end, God had used 4 rejected outcasts to break a siege, humble a king, and fulfill a prophecy. Because sometimes, the greatest acts of deliverance begin with those no one expects. Years had passed since the Shunammite woman had received her son back from death. Life had continued quietly in her home, touched by miracle, sustained by memory. But Elisha had not forgotten her. One day, the prophet came to her with a solemn warning. "Arise," he said, "and go with your household, and sojourn wherever you can, for the Lord has called for a famine, and it will come upon the land for 7 years." No questions were asked. She obeyed, packing her belongings and leaving her home behind. She and her son journeyed to the land of the Philistines, living as foreigners while Israel withered under drought and hunger. 7 long years passed. Fields lay fallow, homes were abandoned, and memories of prosperity turned to dust. But when the famine finally ended, the woman returned, only to find her land taken, her house occupied. Others had claimed what was rightfully hers. She had no army, no legal advocate, no social power. So she went to the only place she could, the palace, to plead for the return of her property. At that very moment, a conversation was taking place between the king of Israel and none other than Gehazi, Elisha's former servant. Though once disgraced, Gehazi was now recounting stories of Elisha's miracles, perhaps trying to restore his standing. "Tell me all the great things Elisha has done," the king had asked. And Gehazi obliged. As he spoke, he told the very story of the Shunammite woman, of how Elisha had raised her son from the dead. And just as the tale left his lips, the woman herself appeared before the court, her son standing beside her. Gehazi's eyes widened. "My lord, O king," he said, pointing. "This is the woman, and this is her son, whom Elisha restored to life." The timing was divine. The king, moved by the living testimony standing before him, not only restored her house and land, but commanded that all the income from her fields during the years of famine be repaid to her. She had left everything in obedience to a prophet's word, and returned to find Jehovah's hand had gone ahead of her. It was more than justice, it was restoration. In a world where widows were often forgotten, she was remembered. In a nation still wrestling with idolatry and instability, she was honored. Because when God speaks a promise through his prophet, even years of famine cannot erase what he intends to restore. Not every revelation given to a prophet brought comfort. Some visions came with the weight of sorrow, glimpses of destruction that no miracle could prevent. One day, as Elisha traveled through Damascus, the king of Syria, Ben-Hadad, was gravely ill. When word reached him that the man of God was nearby, he sent his trusted servant Hazael with lavish gifts to inquire of the Lord. "Shall I recover from this disease?" the king asked through Hazael. The question was simple. The answer devastating. Elisha looked at Hazael and replied, "Go say to him, you shall certainly recover. But the Lord has shown me that he shall surely die." Then Elisha fixed his eyes on Hazael, so long, so intensely, that Hazael grew uncomfortable. And suddenly Elisha began to weep. Hazael, taken aback, asked, "Why does my Lord weep?" The prophet's voice cracked as he responded, "Because I know the evil that you will do to the people of Israel. You will set their fortresses on fire, kill their young men with the sword, dash their children to pieces, and rip open their pregnant women." The words fell like stones. Hazael recoiled. "But what is your servant, who is but a dog, that he should do this great thing?" he asked, as if the idea was too absurd to consider. But Elisha's eyes did not waver. "The Lord has shown me that you are to be king over Syria." Hazael returned to his master with the prophet's message, telling him only the first part. "You shall certainly recover." But the next day, he took a thick cloth, soaked it in water, and smothered the king to death. Hazael rose to the throne, just as Elisha had seen. And the horrors he would bring upon Israel, burned cities, bloodied borders, unthinkable cruelty, would become a tragic fulfillment of prophecy. Elisha had healed the sick, raised the dead, fed the hungry, and unveiled God's armies. But here, he could only weep. For though the prophet could see the future, even he could not always stop it. Some judgments were already written. Some hearts were already hardened. And sometimes, all a prophet could do was cry. The days of Elisha the prophet were drawing to a close. He had outlived kings, outlasted wars, and witnessed more miracles than most would dare to dream. Yet now, the man who once outran chariots and parted rivers lay on his bed, weakened by illness, not by judgment, but by time. Word of his condition reached King Joash of Israel, who came to visit him. And as he entered the room, the king did not see a frail old man. He saw the nation's true defense fading before his eyes. With trembling voice, Joash wept beside the prophet's bed and cried, "My father, my father! The chariots of Israel and its horsemen!" The same words Elisha had once spoken when Elijah was taken up. It was not just a cry of grief, it was a cry of fear. Elisha had been Israel's covering, its invisible shield, its divine compass. What would become of the nation when he was gone? But even on his deathbed, Elisha had one final prophecy left to give, one last word from the mouth of God. "Take a bow and some arrows," he instructed. The king obeyed. Elisha sat up with what strength he had and placed his hands over Joshua's as he readied the bow. "Open the east window," the prophet said. The king opened it. "Shoot," Elisha commanded. The arrow flew. And Elisha declared, "The Lord's arrow of victory, the arrow of victory over Syria. For you shall fight the Syrians in effect until you have made an end of them." Then came a strange request. "Take the arrows and strike the ground." Joash did, once, twice, 3 times, and then stopped. Elisha's face hardened with disappointment. "You should have struck 5 or 6 times," he said. "Then you would have struck Syria down completely. But now you shall strike Syria only 3 times. It was a moment of prophetic grief, a glimpse into what could have been if faith had matched God's promise. Even in his final hours, Elisha was shaping history, offering victory, and reminding Israel that their fate was tied not to strength or strategy, but to obedience and trust. Soon after, the prophet who had once watched Elijah ascend would himself descend into death, not in fire, but in peace. And yet, even in death, Elisha's ministry was not over. For the Spirit of God would not let his story end in silence. Elisha was gone. The man who had once parted rivers, healed the sick, raised the dead, and called fire from the sky had breathed his last. His body was laid to rest in a tomb, sealed in silence, remembered by the faithful but largely forgotten by the restless nation he had once led. Time marched on. Raiding bands from Moab began to plague Israel, striking suddenly, leaving fear and ruin in their wake. One day, as men were burying another body, a man freshly deceased, they spotted a band of Moabite raiders in the distance. Panic surged through them. With no time to finish the burial properly, they looked around in desperation. Elisha's tomb stood nearby. Acting on instinct more than ceremony, they flung the dead man's body into the prophet's grave and fled. But then, something miraculous happened. As soon as the lifeless corpse touched the bones of Elisha, breath returned. Muscles twitched. Eyes opened. The man stood upright, alive. Elisha's anointing had not died with him. The power of God still rested upon his very bones. Even in death, the prophet was used by Jehovah to demonstrate that his spirit does not fade, his promise does not expire, and his presence cannot be sealed in a tomb. What began as a hasty burial turned into resurrection. The living God had breathed once more through a vessel long at rest. It was a final miracle, unseen by crowds, unannounced by kings, but echoing through generations. Elisha's grave, far from being the end, became a reminder: the word and power of Jehovah are never buried. They wait. They endure. And they rise again at the appointed time. For when God moves, even bones can bring life.